To begin by recognizing that racism is not separate from education. Okay, there's a reason why South Lake looks the way it does, right? There's a reason why I live in Oak Cliff, and there's a reason why schools in Oak Cliff have student bodies that look like they do. There's a reason for that. And our goal as educators is to think about how do we allow ourselves, one, and two, how can we bring those issues up for students? Now, it might seem like a crazy thing to go to a fifth grader and say, well, what do you think about the fact that South Lake looks like this and your school looks like this? Those might be too broad of concepts and contexts. But in your classroom, there are moments where we can begin to think about the operation of power. How can we start to think about, with looking at a text, to help students really understand the way the text is positioning them, the language being used in the text, how that might be shaping their perspectives. And so one of the key things, one of the key things as a teacher is to understand the difference between equality, equity, and liberation. Okay. I began my teaching career with this heavy focus on equality. I was going to treat all my students the same. Okay. And equality is a form of reproduction. All right. I'll say that again. Equality is a form of reproduction. When we treat all students equally, we don't account for students, as Christina said, who are living in the forest. We don't account for students who have very different ways of seeing the world. Another thing that Christina mentioned was her culture, the fact that she has a culture and that wasn't always recognized. The latest Christina, I'll call you Christina number two if you don't mind, Christina, talked about the context in which children are being kicked out of their buildings. When we talk about equality, when we teach through equality, we do not recognize those nuances of the students' experiences because we're treating all students the same. Okay. So what we have to do is equity. We have to think about equity, which is really reflecting on the individual student, understanding them, building relationships with them. One of the things that I really loved was the quote that said, one of our colleagues just shared, forgive me, I can't remember the person, to say, I need to understand the community within which I am teaching. So many schools try to sever the relationship between the student and their families. Okay. But Education for Liberation says no, education includes the family. The family is part of the educational process. And so equity in the classroom is thinking about each of your students, thinking through their needs, being compassionate, being kind, developing relationships with them. When I heard about a student, being in your arms, sharing something that's deeply traumatic for them, there's a relationship that's been built there. And that is the foundation of equity. But we can only do so much as individual teachers. We also have to think about the systems, the policies, the procedures that enforce oppression, that dehumanize students. We have to think about liberation, and that's what liberation is all about. It's not only about the interpersonal relationships, but it's about looking at the curriculum. It's about looking at the discipline policies that we might have. It's about looking at the policies that we don't have, okay? Often we focus on the policies that we do have, but sometimes there's policies that are not there. And when we think about liberation, it's about advocating for systemic, what we call systemic change. And Gobani is going to talk a little bit about what we mean by that. So just to recap, equality is reproduction. Okay, when we treat students the same, we don't take into account their differences. When we don't take into account their differences, they end up exactly where they were. Okay, when we teach through equity, we acknowledge them as individuals and we teach through that lens. And in that way, they succeed. But if we don't liberate, if we don't advocate for policies, then they can only go so far. They have to have some of the barriers removed. And that's some of our jobs as educators and administrators.